When the iron doors groaned open, the first thing that hit the Union soldiers was the smell. It was a thick, cloying mixture of unwashed bodies, stale air, and human despair. Inside the basement of the Thornhill Estate, a sprawling Georgia plantation captured in the waning days of 1864, 23 children blinked against a sliver of torchlight that cut through the darkness they had known as their entire world. They huddled together, a silent, trembling mass. Some were toddlers, no older than 4, others were on the cusp of adolescence. And as the soldiers' eyes adjusted, they saw it, the chilling, unnatural uniformity. Every child had the same high cheekbones, the same sharp jawline. And in the flickering light, every pair of eyes glowed with the same haunting, pale green hue, framed by auburn hair shot through with threads of gold. They were a collection of ghosts, living echoes of a single person. The eldest, a girl of 13 who seemed to carry the weight of all their suffering in her young shoulders, finally spoke to the stunned officers. Her voice was a dry whisper, a sound that had rarely been used. "Mistress says we are her legacy," she said, her green eyes never leaving the soldier's face. "We cannot leave. We are her blood." The statement, so simple and so monstrous, made veteran soldiers who had witnessed the carnage of Antietam and Gettysburg physically ill. An official military record from the 34th Massachusetts Infantry mentions the discovery only once, in a letter marked confidential, a document that would lie buried in regimental archives for more than a century. Local histories of Burke County, Georgia, omit the Thornhill Estate entirely, as if the plantation, its mistress, and the 23 children in its cellar simply never existed. But they did. And what Katherine Thornhill created in the 16 years between her husband's death and the arrival of federal troops stands as one of the most profoundly disturbing chapters in American history. It was a systematic, meticulously documented breeding program, designed with cold, scientific precision to create generations of enslaved people who could never truly escape their bondage, because they were genetically, inescapably, tied to their owner. Before we descend into the full story of Katherine Thornhill and the nightmare she built from blood and ambition, I need to ask you something. If this story is already making your skin crawl, if you feel that cold dread that comes from brushing up against a truth that history tried to bury, then hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is dedicated to unearthing the darkest corners of our past, the secrets they don't teach you in school. And I want to know where this story is finding you. Drop a comment below and tell me what state or city you're in. Does your town have secrets like this, buried just beneath the surface? Let's find out together. Now, let us go back to where it all began. To a cold February morning in 1847, when a young widow inherited a dying plantation and conceived of a plan so vile it would haunt the red clay of Georgia for generations. The winter Katherine Danforth Thornhill buried her husband was the coldest Burke County had seen in 20 years. Frost clung to the Spanish moss, making the ancient live oaks look like skeletal chandeliers. The Thornhill Estate, 1,700 acres of tired red clay soil that seemed to bleed when it rained, was dying along with its master. This was cotton country, but the land was exhausted, overworked by decades of a single crop. Plantations that had boomed in the 1820s were now struggling, squeezed between falling prices and the constant threat of foreclosure. Katherine's late husband, Jonathan, had been a poor manager and a worse gambler. By the time a winter fever took him, the estate was mortgaged to the hilt, its fields were barren, and creditors were circling like buzzards over a fresh kill. At 28, Katherine was a widow trapped in the ruins of her husband's failure. She was old Georgia money, a Danforth from Augusta, raised with the expectation of managing a grand household, not presiding over its dissolution. But the inheritance was a poison chalice, crushing debt, decaying buildings, and a 16-year-old stepson, Richard, who looked at her with an unnerving mixture of grief and pure hatred. Richard was Jonathan's son from a first marriage, a sullen, bookish boy who saw Katherine as the usurper who had replaced his sainted mother. He found her cold, she found him weak, sentimental, and dangerously progressive. He had once suggested they teach the enslaved to read, an idea so radical, so threatening to the natural order of things, that Katherine had forbidden him from ever speaking of it again. The 31 enslaved people who remained on the property lived under a pall of constant fear. 16 others had already been sold off to cover Jonathan's debts, and those who were left knew it was only a matter of time before their families, too, were torn apart on the auction block. The estate's lawyer, a blunt man named Ambrose Talbot, laid out Katherine's options. Sell everything and return to her father's house in Augusta, a dependent spinster branded by failure. Or, somehow, miraculously, make the plantation profitable again. Neither option was acceptable. Returning to Augusta was a public admission of defeat. But traditional farming wouldn't save Thornhill. The land was spent. The equipment was broken. She had no money to buy more workers. It was during one of those long, silent nights, staring at the bleak numbers in the estate's ledgers by a single flickering candle, that the idea came to her. It arrived not in a flash of evil inspiration, but with the cold, crystalline logic of a mathematical proof. If she couldn't buy workers, she would breed them. But not in the haphazard way of other plantations. No, Katherine envisioned something far more systematic, more controlled, more elegant in its monstrosity. She would create a workforce biologically bound to the estate. Workers who could never be sold, because they were her own descendants. Workers who would feel an instinctive loyalty, because Thornhill was literally in their blood. She was still young enough to bear children. She would select the strongest, healthiest men from her enslaved population. Their children would be raised with special treatment to ensure their compliance, and when they matured, they would be paired with others to produce the next generation. It was a plan of breathtaking depravity, but to Katherine, it was salvation. She began a new journal, not a diary of feelings, but what she chillingly called her cultivation records. Using a simple substitution cipher, she laid out her vision. Children became seedlings. The chosen men were rootstock. Pregnancies were plantings. The pages filled with diagrams that looked like charts for breeding livestock, because in her mind, that is precisely what they were. Her first selection was a man named Isaac, 24 years old, known for his strength. She summoned him to the main house one March evening. Her journal entry was stark and clinical. Asterisk first planting completed with rootstock number 1. Weather clear and mild. Asterisk. By April, she was certain. Asterisk initial cultivation successful. Anticipate harvest in December. Asterisk Richard, her stepson, was the first to sense the wrongness that had begun to seep into the very walls of the house. In late May, he noticed his stepmother had stopped her morning rides. She took her meals in her room, dismissing her personal servant. Then, in early June, hidden behind a bookshelf in the library, he overheard a conversation that made the blood freeze in his veins. Katherine was meeting with Miriam Grayson, the local midwife, a woman known for her skill and her discretion. "You're certain of your condition?" Mrs. Grayson asked. "Quite certain," Katherine replied. "Sometime in early December, I should think." "And Mr. Thornhill passed in February, you said." A weighted pause hung in the air. "My late husband and I were intimate in January," Katherine said, her voice a sheet of ice. "Shortly before his final illness." Richard pressed himself against the bookcase, his breath catching in his throat. It was a lie. A brazen, impossible lie. His father had been bedridden all of January, delirious with fever. There had been no intimacy. The child Katherine was carrying had been conceived in March or April. With someone else. The scandal would mean utter ruin. But more than that, it was the cold-blooded deception that horrified him. She intended to pass this child off as his father's heir, to build her entire future on a foundation of fraud. He began to watch. He saw Isaac summoned to the main house, always after dark. He saw the subtle shift in Katherine's demeanor toward the man, not kindness, but a chilling sort of professional assessment. By July, Richard was certain. Isaac was the father. The realization filled him with a nauseous horror. What kind of woman was capable of such a calculated, monstrous act? He found the answer in August. While Katherine was away, he picked the lock on her writing desk and found the leather-bound journal. It took him 3 agonizing days to crack the cipher. And what he read made him want to scream. This wasn't just an affair. It was a program. A meticulous, long-term plan to breed a captive population. The journal was filled with chilling notes on desirable physical traits, charts of planned pairings, calculations of birth rates. It was a blueprint for turning human beings into a self-sustaining crop. Richard's hands shook so badly he could barely copy the pages, translating the horrific code. This was proof. This would expose her. That night at dinner, Katherine looked at him, her pale green eyes boring into his. "Richard," she said, her voice casual, "have you been in my study recently? Some of my papers seem disturbed." "No, ma'am," he lied, his throat constricting. "Good," she said, cutting her meat with surgical precision. "Because family loyalty is everything, Richard. Without it, we are simply animals tearing at each other. I would hate for your father's memory to be tarnished by scandal, especially scandal that might emerge from within his own household." The threat was unmistakable. If he spoke, she would destroy him, painting him as a resentful, disturbed boy. Who would they believe? He burned the copied pages that night, the ashes of his courage floating up the chimney. But he couldn't unsee what he'd seen. And soon after, he began to feel unwell. It started with a profound, bone-deep fatigue. Then came the headaches, the muscle weakness, the stomach pains. Katherine was all solicitous concern, preparing his meals herself, bringing him broths and tonics prescribed by Mrs. Grayson for his nervous exhaustion. But Richard had read about arsenic poisoning in the library's old medical texts. He recognized the symptoms in his own wasting body. She was slowly, methodically killing him, eliminating the one person who knew her secret. Trapped in his room, too weak to even walk, he made one last desperate attempt. He spent 3 days scrawling a letter to his grandfather in Augusta, detailing everything. He bribed a young house servant, Pearl, to post it. But Pearl, terrified of her mistress, took the letter straight to Katherine. Katherine read it in front of Richard, her face a blank mask, before tossing it into the fire. "You're very ill, darling," she cooed, her voice a terrifying imitation of tenderness. "The fever is affecting your mind. It's a mercy, really, that you won't have to suffer much longer." Richard Thornhill died on December 3, 1847. The cause was listed as consumption. 4 days after his funeral, Katherine gave birth to a healthy son with auburn hair and pale green eyes. She named him Jonathan, after her late husband. The years that followed were a testament to the chilling success of Katherine's plan. To the outside world, Thornhill Estate made a miraculous recovery. But within its borders, it had become a human laboratory. Katherine bore 4 more children between 1848 and 1853, each with a different, carefully selected father. The midwife, Mrs. Grayson, became her silent partner in crime, not only delivering Katherine's children but also performing forced abortions on any enslaved women whose pregnancies fell outside of Katherine's master plan. One woman, Ruth, who tried to run rather than lose her baby child, was dragged back and held down while the procedure was performed. She survived, but her spirit was broken. She died 2 years later, a ghost haunting the quarters. By 1856, Katherine's own 10 children were being raised in a bizarre limbo. Legally enslaved, but living in the main house, they were taught to read and write by Katherine herself, who they knew only as their charitable mistress. She was grooming them for the next phase, carefully tracking their growth and temperaments in her journals, planning their future pairings decades in advance. The men she used as rootstock were trapped in a unique psychological hell, forced to father children they could never claim, watching their own offspring being raised as tools for their enslaver. When one man, Thomas, tried to refuse, he was whipped nearly to death and then forced to comply anyway. The heart of this nightmare was a windowless room Katherine called the Heritage Room. Here, she kept her journals, vials containing locks of hair from each child, and elaborate, hand-drawn charts mapping out her genetic dynasty. It was a shrine to her obsession, a place where she planned the future of 100 souls, all bound to her by blood and bondage. But a system built on such profound lies cannot hold forever. In 1863, her second-born daughter, Eleanorina, now 14, discovered one of the coded journals. Just as Richard had 16 years earlier, she painstakingly deciphered it. The revelation shattered her world. The woman she called mistress was her mother. A field hand named Thomas was her father. And the charts on the wall of the heritage room laid out her own future, to be paired, like livestock, to produce the next generation of slaves. She confronted Katherine, shaking with a rage born of ultimate betrayal. "I know what you are," she screamed. "I know what I am." Katherine's response was swift and brutal. She laid out the truth with cold precision, ending with a chilling ultimatum. "You will participate in this program," she said, her face inches from her daughter's. "Because the alternative is that I sell you to a plantation in Mississippi where they work women to death in 5 years. You will say nothing. You will do your duty. Do you understand?" Eleanorina understood, but Katherine had made a fatal mistake. She had let the truth escape its cage. Eleanorina began to talk, first to her older siblings. Jonathan, the eldest, had been so thoroughly indoctrinated he couldn't see the wrongness of the plan. But the others, Abigail and Margaret, they saw. The knowledge spread like poison through the house. Then, Eleanorina began secretly visiting the quarters, learning the true stories of her father and the other men and women broken by her mother's system. An alliance began to form, a quiet, desperate rage uniting the children of the main house with the people in the quarters. Katherine sensed the shift. The air at Thornhill grew thick with unspoken rebellion. To reassert her control, she made an example of a 17-year-old girl named Grace who tried to run away. Grace was caught and whipped publicly, in front of everyone, including Katherine's own children. The message was clear: this is what happens to those who defy me. But Katherine had miscalculated. The brutal display didn't inspire terror, it solidified resolve. It proved she was afraid. And if she was afraid, she was vulnerable. The final break came in March of 1864. With news of Sherman's advance and the Confederacy's imminent collapse, the enslaved population was filled with a hope so powerful it was almost a physical thing. Katherine, seeing her life's work about to be swept away, panicked. She gathered her 11 biological children in the heritage room. "The Yankees may come," she told them, her eyes glittering with a wild, manic light. "They will try to take you from me, to destroy our family. I cannot allow that." She produced a box containing bottles of laudanum. "I want to protect you," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "This will provide eternal peace." But it was too late. Her children were no longer her pawns. Jonathan, the boy she had so carefully molded, stood against her. "No," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "I know what you are. You're a monster." In that moment, seeing the unified defiance in the faces of the children she had created, Katherine knew she had lost. Grabbing her precious journals and charts, she fled the room, screaming, "You think you can escape me? These records will survive. They'll prove I was right." She ran from the house, across the dark yard, and straight toward the quarters, where the people she had tormented for 16 years emerged from their cabins to meet her. What happened next was swift and final. When Jonathan and Eleanorina arrived moments later, the yard was in chaos. Katherine's journals were torn and burning in a small fire. Katherine herself was gone. "Where is she?" Jonathan demanded of an older woman named Hope. Hope's face was a mask in the firelight. "Gone," she said, her voice flat. "She had it coming. Now you have a choice, boy. You can raise hell about your mama, or you can understand that justice got done here tonight and let it rest." Eleanorina looked at her brother, her face pale, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Let it rest," she whispered. Katherine Thornhill was never seen again. When the war ended and federal troops finally arrived, they found the 23 children, the final products of her program, locked in the basement. They heard the whispers, they saw the evidence of what had been done, but the Union captain in charge, seeing the depth of the depravity, elected not to pursue the matter of Katherine's disappearance. "It seems to me," he wrote in his confidential report, "that whatever justice was enacted upon this woman was well deserved." The people of Thornhill scattered after emancipation, carrying their secrets with them. Jonathan drifted west, dying in Texas with a notebook filled with a single repeated sentence: "I did not choose this. Eleanorina moved to Savannah, married, and never had children of her own. The estate itself fell to ruin, the land eventually sold, the house consumed by fire. In 1871, a well driller discovered a woman's skeleton in an old cistern on the property. The coroner ruled the death a homicide from blunt force trauma. The body was buried in an unmarked grave. The full truth remained buried, a secret kept by an entire community, until fragmented records, a deathbed confession, a captain's forgotten letter, a family memoir, began to surface decades later, painting a picture of the horror and the final, brutal justice that took place at Thornhill. Today, the site is nothing but fields and forest. No historical marker stands. But the story persists, a testament not only to the monstrous evil one person can conceive, but to the unbreakable will of those who endure it. Katherine Thornhill sought to create a legacy of blood and bondage, a dynasty built on the absolute control of human life. But in the end, the people she sought to enslave, the very children she created, rose up and erased her. They survived. They became free. And by carrying her secret to their graves, they ensured that the only legacy she truly left behind was an unmarked patch of earth and a story whispered in the dark, a chilling reminder that no power is absolute, and no evil can outrun the justice it is due.